Explaining Hitler by Rosenbaum, Part 2. This part consists of chapters 11 through 20. Part 5. The Art of Evil and the Future of It, in which the perils of getting too close to the Führer are explored. Chapter 11. To the Gestapo Cottage, or A Night Close to the Führer, in which the philosopher Beryl Lang closes in on the locus of Hitler's evil in his identity as an artist. Night and fog on the Obersalzberg, Hitler's mountain retreat. We seem to have lost our way, although Herr H., often in error, never in doubt, insists he knows exactly where we are. And so, despite the blowing fog that bounces the high beams of his BMW back into our faces, obscuring all but a few feet of the icy pavement in front of us, Herr H. presses on up the mountain. He's on a mission. He wants to spend a night close to the Führer. In a sense, so do I. The problem is that the main road up to the top of the mountain that had once been Hitler's personal peak has been barricaded. Something to do with the preparations for the local Christmas market, not the dangerous ice, Herr H. insists, as he pilots us onto an even narrower, icier switchback route with no guardrails. The road seems dangerous to me, and nothing less than terrifying to Herr H.'s Israeli girlfriend, Miriam, who has only recently recovered from a near-fatal car wreck on a similarly icy road, and who is rigidly braced in the front passenger seat for a repetition of the horror. But Herr H. is determined not to permit poor visibility, dangerous road conditions, or painful memories to deter him from the now so near fulfillment of a long-held fantasy, the goal of this pilgrimage to the mountaintop shrine. In 1942, Martin Bormann announced with great fanfare a grand construction project on the mountain that had, since the 1920s, been Hitler's Alpine retreat, the place where Hitler built a sumptuous rustic palace for himself, the Berghof, his Hall of the Mountain King. Here Hitler would escape from the embroilments of Munich, and then Berlin, politics, to meditate amid breathtaking Alpine vistas, hike in traditional Bavarian lederhosen, and imbibe the crystalline mountain air. Here he'd receive heads of state and host strategy conferences with his generals, dictating from that heady perspective the future map of Europe against the backdrop of snow-capped peaks, visible through vast floor-to-ceiling picture windows. It was here Hitler could ascend skyward to another eyrie, to the tiny tea-house at the very top of the mountain, where he could survey in lonely splendor the realm he commanded from his eagle's nest. And it was here, Martin Bormann announced, that at the request of the Führer, he was constructing a grand guest house for the German people on Hitler's Magic Mountain. Here, the politically ambitious and slyly self-promoting Bormann proclaimed, every German who participated in the pilgrimage to the beloved Führer would have the opportunity to spend 1 day and 1 night close to the Führer for only 1 Reichsmark. As it turned out, construction was so expensive and demand for rooms so great on the part of middle management Nazi officials that only the elite of the Third Reich could be accommodated, although the structure Bormann built was a vast, rambling behemoth whose rustic exterior concealed high-ceilinged Teutonic reception halls, banquet rooms, and an extensive, high-tech underground bunker. Still, the dream of the pilgrimage, the goal of spending 1 night there, 1 night close to the Führer, has not died. It's alive in Herr H. Getting close to the Führer is Herr H.'s lifelong project. He's a 45-year-old Viennese furniture restorer and amateur historian, of the variety one sarcastic German journalist characterized as the Hitler mit Schlippern, Hitler in slippers school. They tend to be something more than serious memorabilia collectors, although they are that too, and something less than serious historians. I'd first met Herr H. as a result of my Gailey-Raubal investigations. He had attracted some notice when he petitioned the city of Vienna to exhume Gailey's body, in order to see if further forensic evidence on the circumstances of her death could be garnered from the remains. The pro-Hitler public prosecutor had forestalled full forensic autopsy in 1931. The Vienna city government had derailed Herr H's effort over the question of the certainty of the grave location. Gailey's body had been moved from its pride of place in Vienna's central cemetery shortly after the war, when the Hitler family had perforce stopped making payments on its upkeep. Her remains in a zinc coffin had been shifted to an unmarked field of paupers' graves. But Herr H. claimed to have dug up the moldering schematic diagrams of the cemetery that pinpointed Gailey's new resting place. The city disputed Herr H.'s certainty, and there the matter rested, although not Herr H., who produced an elaborate, privately printed volume of Gailey-Raubal documents, recollections, and interviews he'd conducted with those still alive who knew her. I found Herr H.'s attitude toward Gailey and Hitler curiously inconsistent and sometimes self-contradictory. He claimed at one point he'd solved the case and that he knew the name of an SS man who'd murdered Gailey at Hitler's orders. But I hadn't been convinced of the authenticity of the documentary evidence he'd shown me. An entry from a purported diary kept by Gailey's supposed spiritual advisor, a Viennese priest named Father Punt, and Herr H. didn't take up my offer to have the diary paper-tested for historical authenticity. But despite trying to promote proof that Hitler had Gailey murdered, he didn't seem to be too exercised over Hitler's other murders. It was in keeping with the disturbingly serene view of the Hitler-Mitch-Lippern school. Not neo-Nazi, not denying the Holocaust, but choosing to focus instead on the memorabilia Hitler, the personal Hitler, the Hitler relaxing at home with his beloved dog Blondie in Eva Braun's home movies, the Hitler of the warm reminiscences by his secretarial staff and valets, who spoke of his fondness for their children, his delight in remembering their birthdays, the nightly tea parties in the command bunkers, the Gemütlichkeit Hitler of the table talk. Underlying Herr H.'s ability to sustain this attitude is the relativization, the historicization of Hitler, accomplished by the German nationalist historians of the Historiker Streit in the 80s, the ones who made the comparative evil argument. Stalin was worse. Stalin invented mass murder and concentration camps. Hitler's brutality was a response to the threat of the bloodthirsty Asiatic Bolsheviks in the East. Hitler was the lesser, or at least the later evil, in world history. Herr H.'s mother was a post-war refugee from Stalinist Czechoslovakia who'd fled to Vienna, where Herr H. was born in 1949, and imbued him with a horror of the Bolsheviks. At an early age, he began to collect Wehrmacht uniforms and Hitler memorabilia, building up his collection from a personal hobby to a thriving business supplying German uniforms and ordnance to movie companies making Nazi-period films. This, along with his chain of antique furniture restoration shops and some private dealings in Hitler watercolors and the like, have paid for the brand-new BMW and the expensive Armani jackets he wears over his carefully faded pressed jeans and his Gucci loafers. He's a relatively genial fellow, and we'd come to an uneasy truce over our respective attitudes after a clash over roast goose at his favorite Vienna restaurant. After drinking some wine, Herr H. had been declaiming that the Russian people deserved their suffering under communism because they'd put up with Stalin and his henchmen for so long. I countered by asking him if he then agreed with those who said the German people deserved their suffering for putting up with Hitler. For whatever reason, he had not wanted to progress beyond relativizing Stalin and Hitler's comparative evil to explicitly portraying Hitler as somehow more defensible than Stalin. In a sense, Herr H. and I were using each other. He hoped that I would promote his solution to the Gailey-Raubal case, which, in fact, because of my skepticism over the diary, I did not. And he had proved useful to me in getting access to certain Hitler landmarks in Vienna. He had, for instance, established a relationship with the director of the Mannerheim, the still-functioning men's shelter Hitler had called home for 3 long years of his lost period in Vienna, when his artistic ambitions had been crushed and he'd been reduced to scraping together pennies by selling his stilted postcard renditions of scenic views of Vienna landmarks. That despondent and disillusioned period in the men's shelter was a crucial one in Hitler's development, one that saw the destruction and loss of his romantic artistic illusions. Some believe it was the interlude when other, more sinister illusions took their place. Many have argued that it was in some encounter there in the Mannerheim, or in some moment of embittered introspection, some vision there, that triggered Hitler's metamorphosis from struggling artist and harmless bohemian to the grim hater he became. The evidence on the question of a transformation at the men's shelter is mixed, corrupted in part by several con artist inmates who tried to cash in on Hitler's later fame by claiming they'd been his soulmates there. I'd read all the Mannerheim accounts, but had been surprised to learn that it still was open, still served the same function it had 8 decades ago. It was still home to vagrants and the barely working poor, the able-bodied homeless, the refugees, the restless and vagabonds who'd drifted in or had been driven to Vienna from all corners of Europe. And so, one gray November morning, I found myself wandering through the halls of the Mannerheim, trying to get a sense of the way it looked and felt to the youthful Hitler. Very little has changed, the director told me. He meant very little of the architecture, but it was true of more than that. There's a famous disputed photo taken of the interior of the Mannerheim during the period when Hitler was in residence. It shows a dark-clad figure seated in front of a window off the kitchen area, staring out the window into the void. Some have said it's Hitler. It's probably not, but it could have been. Touring the ground floor, I came upon a figure seated in that same position, staring out into the same hopeless void, wearing a black wool sweater and a black knitted watch cap, smoking a pipe and staring vacantly into space. A refugee, the director said, a fellow who'd fled from Macedonia after the political breakup of the Balkans, his home destroyed in the ethnic strife that ensued. In a pessimistic frame of mind, as who could not help but be in this place, one could imagine the same brew of bitter hatred secreting itself inside this man as it had in Hitler. As the director said, very little has changed. After assisting me in gaining entrance to the Mannerheim, Herr H. disclosed he had a favor he wanted to ask me, a dream he wanted me to help fulfill. He knew I was planning to leave Vienna for Munich by train. He offered instead to drive me to Munich with a stop at the Obersalzberg, if I could help make it possible for him to stay in the guest house Bormann had built in Hitler's compound, the place where, Bormann had promised, every citizen of the Reich would be able to spend a night close to the Führer. The reason he hadn't accomplished it before, the reason he thought I could help, was that after the war the Bormann guest house had been taken over by American army authorities. They'd dynamited Hitler's personal residence to destroy its possible future as a shrine for neo-Nazis. But it was felt the guest house was not itself imbued with the kind of numinous evil Hitler's own house had been. Instead, it was transformed into a kind of mountain resort facility for American servicemen and their families stationed in Germany. Herr H. was under the impression that it was open to all American citizens and their guests as well, and so he asked me to make a reservation for me and him and his Israeli girlfriend at the Hotel General Walker, as the place was now called. I know why Herr H. wanted to spend a night close to the Führer, but I wondered what his Israeli girlfriend Miriam's attitude was. She seemed as normal a young woman as any of her generation, born in Austria, raised in Israel from age 5 to 20, now returned to Vienna, where she was an apartment rental agent. On the way to Munich from the Obersalzberg, when Herr H. stopped to gas up his BMW at a roadside stop in the heart of Bavaria, as lederhosen-clad villagers in peaked alpine hats, decorated with colorful turkey feathers, picnicked outside the buffet, I asked Miriam what it felt like spending time with Herr H. in an apartment filled with Hitler and SS memorabilia. She was enthusiastic about the opportunity it represented, an opportunity to learn about Hitler. "In Israel, you know, it was almost forbidden to talk ever of Hitler," she said. "It is too awful. But I want to understand, and through knowing H, I have learned very much." It was hard to argue with the impulse she was expressing, although one might quarrel with the method. But in a sense, she was pursuing the same quest as Herr H, and one not too dissimilar from mine. In mapping the labyrinthine thickets of Hitler explanations, in trying to disentangle the historical Hitler from the meanings projected upon him, from the adhesion of spurious facts and theories, I was, in my own way, trying to get close to the Führer. And so we set out from Vienna on a gloomy November Sunday afternoon, stopping for an early dinner on the way, crossing the border into Germany around dusk. It was after dark when we started up the Obersalzberg slopes and found ourselves diverted onto that icily treacherous back road. It was pitch black when we found ourselves turned away from the Hotel General Walker. The cavernous reception hall was filled with a throng of buzz-cut GIs, their wives and babies wearing the Bart Simpson T-shirts that were all the rage that year. The clerk had my reservation, and all seemed in order till she asked me for my army identification. No one had mentioned that on the phone, I said. It seemed they must have assumed I was in the service because, contrary to Herr H.'s information, the Hotel General Walker was not open to all Americans, but only to military personnel. No amount of complaining about how we'd driven 3 hours just to spend the night sufficed. There was no room at the inn for us. Outside, in the cold, clear air of the mountain night, Herr H. pointed up to the eagle's nest, nestled in the snowy crevices just below the peak. "It's closed for the winter," he said. At first I thought he planned on us hiking up the mountainside to take shelter in that inaccessible shrine, but it turned out he had a more congenial, to him at least, backup plan in mind. "Don't worry," he said. "We can always stay at the Gestapo cottage." The Gestapo cottage. The place felt only slightly less sinister than it sounded. It was a compact little inn not far down the mountain from the Hotel General Walker, a place that had been built before Hitler began building his private preserve, a little inn known as far back as the 20s as Zum Türken, because of the Turkish nationality of its original owners. In the 30s, to the great credit of the owners, their clear lack of Nazi sympathies caused Bormann to seize it from them and turn it into a dormitory residence for Hitler's Gestapo bodyguards. After the war, it was returned to the ownership of the original family, whose descendants run it now, although to the likes of Herr H, it remains always the Gestapo cottage. Despite the proprietor family's lack of sympathy, the place, because of its location, attracts those obsessed with and sympathetic to the era, who want to stay in a place that has changed less than any other Hitler landmark, except perhaps the Mannerheim. By the registration desk, one can find books filled with cheerful photographs of a relaxed, genial Hitler, taken at various sites on the mountaintop. Hitler with his beloved dog Blondie, the one he killed with cyanide when he was testing the poison he would take himself. Hitler with blonde children, Hitler with Eva Braun, Hitler posing with alpine-garbed Nazi visitors, Hitler hiking through the wildflowers, Hitler relaxed in front of the breathtakingly picturesque crags. Hitler, in other words, in slippers. And in the Gestapo cottage's cozy common room, where we had a beer before retiring, there is still a picture on the wall of Eva Braun, one that could well have been put there to brighten up the off-duty hours of the Gestapo bodyguards while she and Hitler were still alive. The Gestapo cottage was closed for the season, but the proprietors were only too happy to accommodate such a faithful repeat visitor as Herr H. They opened up the otherwise empty guest floor to make 2 rooms available to us. Despite their hospitality, it was not exactly a place in which I could get a comfortable night's rest. Alone in my room in the nearly empty Gestapo cottage, I couldn't sleep, thinking about the previous occupants of the room, about the spectral seated figure in the Mannerheim I'd seen earlier that day. It was possible, if one allowed one's imagination free rein, to feel, here on Hitler's mountain, the presence of Hitler's evil almost literally thickening the night air. And to a much greater sense than I would care to admit, I did feel something almost palpable, however irrational that may sound. But giving in to it that night was a kind of turning point for the inquiry I was pursuing, one that dramatized to me the perils in the attempt to get close to the Führer, and helped clarify for me what I was really seeking. The most obvious peril was the kind that Herr H. embodied, the way a quest for closeness can devolve into a kind of comfortably engrossing intimacy, one that can metamorphose into the gargantuan nearsightedness of the Hitler-Mitschlippern Gemütlichkeit vision of the Führer. But there was another kind of peril in the path I'd been pursuing, in immersing myself in the literature on the subject, in spending time with those who'd made explaining Hitler their life work, getting too close to the Führer, so close that the magnitude of his evil became a distorting lens that makes any human perspective impossible. So close that the temptation, the inevitable tendency, is to begin looking at all history in terms of how it led to Hitler and the death camps, and a concomitant temptation to examine all human nature for the sources, the wellsprings of Hitler, to view all evil in relation to Hitler's evil. A process that eventually can end up turning Hitler into a kind of graven image, a defining, if not ruling, principle of all being. One also has to question if, as a Jew, as someone who could have been one of his victims, one can look at the subject with any perspective. The tendency is to want to see one's own tragedy as something universal and ultimate, as all mankind's, all history's, all human nature's ultimate tragedy. The German psychiatrist Helm Stierlin reports in the introduction to his psychohistorical study of Hitler that he was impelled to embark on the project, in part at least, by a question his 8-year-old child asked him. Was Hitler the most evil man that ever lived? It's a child's question, but still an important one because it raises the question of how we measure, judge evil. By quantity, by body count, or by the quality of consciousness with which the deed is executed, the malevolence of the intentionality, the conscious awareness of wrongdoing. It's the kind of question I'd been asking ever since H.R. Trevor Roper had surprised me by declaring his belief that Hitler had no conscious awareness of doing wrong, that he was convinced of his own rectitude. One question I formulated that sleepless night on the Obersalzberg, and in the crystalline light of the following morning when the late autumn sun had burned through the fog, was a different one, although it addressed similar issues to that raised by Trevor Roper and by Stierlin's child, issues that sophisticated post-Holocaust philosophers and theologians had been wrestling with for half a century. Do we have to redefine our conventional, centuries-old notions of evil to take into account the nature of Hitler? Or do we have to redefine our notion of Hitler to account for him in terms of our previous notions of evil? To put it another way, to use a familiar Jewish formulation, why is this evil different from all other evils, if it is? Are we too close to know? These are questions I'd been asking, in one form or another, in my encounters with historians such as Bullock and Trevor Roper, thinkers such as George Steiner and Emil Fackenheim, in talking to psychoanalysts, psychohistorians, and other explainers. They are questions that I found a despairing and disappointing number of times to have been begged, evaded, or glossed over. "Well, if he isn't evil, then who is?" Lord Bullock harumphed, as if that answered the question, when, in fact, it just opened it up. Ultimately, however, I did find one philosopher who did not beg the question, did not claim it to be irrelevant or impossible to parse, who did not claim to have a final answer, but who wrestled with it with what I thought was scrupulous honesty, and who seemed to be suggesting a provocative new way of answering it. It came as a surprise to me, having read fairly extensively in the philosophical literature on the question of evil, both in the abstract and in relation to Hitler, to have found someone with something new to say. But I began to sense something both new and important being suggested, in an understated, just short of explicit way, in a work called Act and Idea in the Nazi Genocide by Beryl Lang, the chairman of the philosophy department at the State University of New York's Albany campus. And in a more explicit way, in a preliminary essay Lang drew my attention to called The History of Evil and the Future of the Holocaust. It was a surprise, once I began to understand the implications of Lang's argument, that it had not caused more of a stir when he first published it, although I have a feeling its implications are only beginning to be assessed and debated. Certainly, Lang's book attracted favorable notice when it appeared. He was a fairly prominent writer and thinker on these questions. He'd chaired prestigious symposia and authored 2 previous books on the subject, and his newest work, Act and Idea, had attracted praise. Saul Friedlander, one of the most highly regarded thinkers on the question, called it one of the most important attempts made to face the philosophic implications of the Nazi genocide, and Cynthia Ozick credited Lang with an intellectual and technical force equal to that of Primo Levi. But I fear the power and import of Lang's breakthrough might have been lost on some of his readers because of the reticent nature of Lang's style. In his prose, as well as in his person, he's self-effacing to the point of self-erasing. In part, it's a scholar's modesty and scrupulosity. In part, it's personal modesty, a reluctance to make claims for his own originality, so much so that I was not sure, until I drew it out from him in person, just how original his argument was. Still, when we'd settled down in the comfortable living room of his West Hartford, Connecticut home, even Lang expressed some surprise that many who reviewed and discussed his book had failed to react to his novel argument on the consciousness of evil question. "I wondered about that, too," Lang told me. He speculated that the attention of reviewers, because the audience for the book was primarily philosophers rather than historians, had been drawn to a later section of Act and Idea on Kant, genocide and Kant's Enlightenment. That chapter was Lang's contribution to the debate over where to place the philosophical blame for Hitler, and whether the sources of Nazi totalitarianism and racism might be more attributable to the Enlightenment rather than the old regime it rebelled against. But in fact, it is in the opening 2 sections of Lang's book, Intending Genocide and The Knowledge of Evil and Good, that I believe Lang has made an even more profound and controversial contribution to the debate over the nature of Hitler's evil. Lang takes the problem Hitler poses to the language of evil, the problem raised by Bullock, if not Hitler, then who can we call evil, very seriously. "It's absolutely essential," he told me, "to find a way to fit Hitler into the framework of evil, or reassess whether that framework has any useful value. Finding a way is essential, but that does not guarantee it's possible." And so, in his book, he takes on the 2 obstacles raised against calling Hitler consciously evil, ones that might be called the dysfunction objection and the rectitude objection. Of the first, he says, "If everything is explained by some dysfunction, the one-ball theory, whichever one of them, or you put them all together, then, of course, Why would Hitler be responsible or accountable? What's evil about a dysfunction? It's grounds for a defense of insanity. It's out of my control. And if it's out of my control, then you can't blame me for doing it. But even more problematic, Lang believes, is the argument from rectitude, the argument Trevor Roper encapsulated by saying Hitler could not be considered consciously evil because he was convinced of his own rectitude. It's an argument that dates back more than 2,000 years to Socrates' insistence in the Protagoras that people do wrong only if they have a defect that prevents them from knowing right, or are deluded into mistakenly thinking they are doing right when actually doing wrong. 2 millennia of argument have not found a way around the rectitude problem, sometimes called the Socratic paradox. Even the most searching state-of-the-art philosophical discourse on the question of evil ends up resorting to literature rather than history when it seeks to hold up examples of people who do evil despite knowing it's so. Iago, Milton's Satan, Claggart, the persecutor of Melville's Billy Budd. They are repeat performers in almost all such discussions, and while everyone would like to add Hitler to that list, precious few humans actually fit the description of knowing or believing they were doing evil, and yet doing it anyway. Even the Marquis de Sade believed he was ultimately involved in a liberating project, not an evil one. Political torturers claim to be acting out of ideology or theology. The problem is an embarrassing one for the philosophical profession, since it seems to have argued itself out of what so many people intuitively know or feel, and so almost argued itself out of history. But Lang feels we can't avoid or ignore the problem. We must revise our notion of Hitler, or revise our notion of evil. His most strenuous efforts are devoted to undermining the argument from rectitude. Trevor Roper buys into that, Lang told me. Maybe not blindly, maybe not completely, that they really believed their own metaphors, that the Jews were parasitic, were a microbe, and that they believed the implications to be drawn from that it's just as if they were doctors regarding germs that must be exterminated. And here again, you have the Platonic tradition, which holds that people act in the name of what they take to be good. The question is whether this is an adequate explanation for all the instances of evil we find in the Nazi period. I mean, that's the crucial question. To attack this crucial question, Lang zeroes in on one crucial locus of the rectitude argument, on one of the most famous statements about the Nazi genocide, Himmler's speech to SS officers at Posen on October 6, 1943. Essentially, this was a pep talk Himmler gave to the SS men directly responsible for organizing and executing the death camp slaughter. This was a special group that, Himmler said, had to harden themselves against the human considerations that might call out to them from the mass graves, from the women and children. The hard decision had to be made that this people, the Jews, should be caused to disappear from the earth. Perhaps at a much later time we can consider whether we should say something more about this to the German people. I myself believe that it is better for us together, to have borne this for our people, that we have taken the responsibility for it on ourselves, the responsibility for an act, not just for an idea, and that we should take this secret with us into the grave. A chilling pronouncement, one that represents, in the absence of a signed order from Hitler, one of the most explicit statements on record of the intent and the mindset behind the final solution. As such, it is often cited to refute the arguments of the so-called functionalist school, which holds that there was no central directive or determination to exterminate the Jews, that it just happened out of bureaucratic exigency, the difficulties of otherwise disposing of the millions of Jews in captured Polish and Soviet territory after the 1941 invasion, that it was cobbled together by middle managers rather than imposed from above. But Beryl Lang focuses on this speech as the crux of the rectitude argument, It offers within it suggestions for and against the notion that the top Nazis were convinced of their own rectitude in pursuing the extermination of the Jews. It seems, on the one hand, that Himmler is arguing to the SS men carrying it out that he believes that what they are doing is a noble and elevated mission on behalf of mankind. But on the other hand, could not the injunction to silence or concealment, the necessity of taking the secret to the grave, in fact come less from noble considerations than from Himmler's consciousness of the criminality of their actions? It's worth dwelling on the way Lang deals with the contradictory implications of the Himmler speech, because it illustrates the manner in which he brings to bear the insights of both history and philosophy on the question of the intentionality of Nazi evil. He takes up first the rectitude question, the argument that Hitler, Himmler, and the planners of the final solution thought they were engaged in a noble crusade. The strongest and most inflammatory argument deployed in support of this proposition, that in their own minds at least the top Nazis were idealists, is the Pasteur-Koch analogy, the germ theory of Jewishness. In this view, we must credit the sincerity of the self-image propagated by Hitler and Himmler, that in exterminating the Jews, they were acting akin to idealistic, self-sacrificing doctors, healers, trying to save the human race from a plague. As early as 1919, Hitler wrote that the effect of Jewry will be the racial tuberculosis of nations. The implication: doctors treating a germ-caused disease do not seek to reform or educate the germs, but to exterminate them for the sake of the life of the patient. For the sake of the life of the Aryan race, if the Jews are tuberculosis germs, such germs must be exterminated. Hitler made this analogy explicit in February 1942, as the programmatic extermination of the Jews had gathered momentum. The discovery of the Jewish virus is one of the greatest revolutions that has been undertaken in the history of the world. The struggle we are waging is of the same kind as in the past century, that of Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch. How many diseases can be traced back to the Jewish virus? We shall regain our health only when we exterminate the Jews. Here, then, in its most refined form, is Hitler's preferred self-image, his self-explanation. He is Dr. Hitler, the crusading, germ-fighting hero virologist, trying to save the human race from a plague of deadly infectious germs. The grotesque enormity of the image does not prima facie exclude the possibility that Hitler believed it or deceived himself into believing it, in which case it validates Trevor Roper's rectitude argument. While I am more inclined to see Hitler as a vicious, cold-blooded hater who fabricated, counterfeited a mask of rectitude for the sake of history and expediency, is there any way, aside from retroactive mind-reading, to disprove this medical crusader version of Hitler's self-image? Lang scrupulously examines some of the weaker objections to the medical rectitude model before going on to what I believe is his own stronger approach. Among the weaker objections is a policy shift that has become a famous crux in Hitler studies. The 1944 decision, when the Eastern Front against Stalin was on the verge of collapse, to withdraw railroad cars urgently needed to carry replacement troops to the besieged battlefront, in order to shift them instead to the task of carrying more Jews to the death camps. Lang portrays this as an argument against the rectitude defense. If Hitler's idea was the preservation of the Aryan race and the German nation, it went against these alleged ideals to leave the front defenseless against a Soviet onslaught in order to pursue an apparently selfish personal passion, in this view, to kill Jews. But, in fact, the opposite conclusion could be drawn. Hitler was so deeply, sincerely committed to the view that Jews were an infectious plague on humanity that he was willing to sacrifice the existence of the German nation itself as an independent state in order to preserve the idealistic goal of saving the Aryan race from the Jewish infection for all time. Lose the war against Stalin, but win the war against the Jews, which would make the 1944 train transfer evidence in support of the rectitude argument. Another key objection to the rectitude argument, one made by Bullock among others, is the evidence of concealment and shame. Hitler and the Nazis went to great lengths to keep secret the final solution, which proves that they knew it was wrong, that they were ashamed of what they were doing, which would certainly contravene the view they were convinced of their rectitude. On the other hand, there's nothing intrinsic in the fact of concealment to make it a necessary conclusion that concealment came from shame as opposed to, let's say, idealistic prudence. The kind of self-sacrificing, forbearing, idealistic prudence that Himmler purports to exhibit and urge on his troops in the Posen speech. We are the only ones with the strength and rectitude to see that our ideals require us to take radical, horrific-seeming measures before the rest of the population is fully aware of their idealistic necessity, their medical urgency, the ultimate healing goal of the killing. These difficulties that Lang raises to his attempt to prove consciousness of wrongdoing rather than rectitude on the part of the top Nazis ultimately, I believe, strengthen the case he does make. A case that goes beyond arguing that they did what they did despite knowing it was wrong, to considering the possibility that they did what they did because they knew it was evil. He begins his journey to that remarkable conclusion by suggesting the surprising notion that there may be differences among wrongdoers in respect to the measures of humanity they acknowledge in victims. Acknowledging someone's humanity makes it more difficult to deprive that person of his humanity or his life, which leads Lang to argue that the Nazi dehumanizing process, the systematic brutality and degradation inflicted on the death camp inmates, instead of killing them right away, they first tried to reduce them to subhumans to make them less troubling to kill, by a cruel inversion testifies more strongly even than extermination itself to the essentially human status accorded the Jews to begin with. Emphasis added. Here is a refutation of the Hitler as Pasteur argument, that the final solution was executed by those with a self-image as idealists. In fact, they didn't think of Jews as infectious germs, embodiments of disease. They first had to deliberately, consciously reduce them to that subhuman state in order to make the subsequent killing palatable to humans. Knowingness, deliberation, consciousness of the process of wrongdoing, these are the elements that, for Lang, mark the dehumanization process as evidence of conscious evil. One can conceive of a doctor killing germs, or, say, killing contagion-carrying rabid dogs out of some service to humanity, defending humankind. But a doctor who took what he regarded as a healthy human being and deliberately reduced him to subhuman level, and then killed without compunction or moral scruple, or who claimed moral worth by virtue of that kind of killing, cannot be called anything but consciously evil. The process of systematic dehumanization requires a conscious affirmation of the wrong involved in it. Lang says, that someone human should be made to seem less than human. Here the agent of the act is voluntarily choosing to do wrong as a matter of principle, what is wrong by his lights. Emphasis added. Wrong even by his own lights. This is the state of mind that the Protagoras argues is impossible. Wrongdoers chose wrong out of delusion, from mistaken views of what was right, not from a clear view that they were doing wrong. Proof the Nazis knew what they were doing was wrong by their own lights can be found, Lang believes, in the stages of deliberation required for the carrying out of genocide, deciding that individuals are to be judged not by their merits but as a contaminated group, deciding that the contamination is an imminent threat, and finally, a third stage in which the decision is made that only extermination can avert the danger. Proof the Nazis knew what they were doing was wrong by their own lights can be found, Lang believes, in the stages of deliberation required for the carrying out of genocide. Deciding that individuals are to be judged not by their merits but as a contaminated group, deciding that the contamination is an imminent threat, and finally, a third stage in which the decision is made that only extermination can avert the danger. Each of these stages requires reflection, denial of the evidence against it, thoughtfulness, and deliberation. The dehumanization process is itself an elaborately staged one, requiring not just a highly conscious awareness of what is being done, but an intention to provide false covering, false color for the subsequent killing that might have looked wrong before dehumanization, but right afterward. It is at this point that Lang makes a leap in his argument that few historians and philosophers have been willing to make. The leap from saying that the perpetrators of the final solution did evil despite knowing it was wrong, to the suggestion that they did it because it was wrong. Many philosophers question whether this degree of evil, this kind of person, exists at all outside of literature, where we do have Milton's Satan vowing, "To do ill will be our sole delight," for instance, and Richard III and Iago rub their hands in glee over the evil they design. But even Iago offers a kind of explanation, feels he needs to excuse his evil doing. He's heard it whispered about that Othello had been sleeping with Iago's wife. Iago admits he doesn't necessarily believe it. Rather transparently, he concedes that this explanation is protective coloration for his delight in doing evil for evil's sake. But still, he's fictional. In real life, even Satanists reflect a kind of inverted morality, a need to explain. They believe God is the evil usurper, Satan a misunderstood force for human liberation and good. To do evil despite knowing it's evil is one thing, I said to Lang in his West Hartford living room. But to do it because it's evil is quite another, isn't it? His response to my question stunned me because it had not been suggested explicitly in his book. It was one I could not have imagined, but one that changed the way I've looked at the question ever after. It has something to do with the notion of evil as an art, the art of evil. Lang introduced the subject by referring to the sheer inventiveness of Nazi lies about the genocide. We had been talking about a passage from Hitler's table talk I'd been fixated upon, the passage in which Hitler, Himmler, and Heydrich are ostentatiously debunking the rumor, which they know to be true, that the Jews are being exterminated. It's silly that people should say such things, Hitler piously avers, when we're only parking the Jews in the marshy parts of Russia, although he adds that if it were true, it would be no less than the Jews deserved. It seemed to me a transparent charade in which the three architects of the final solution were becoming the first Holocaust deniers, the first revisionists, so to speak, and doing so in a particularly repulsive, winking and nodding way. It's evidence both of concealing and revealing, this charade, isn't it? I asked Lang. Concealing it for the record, but revealing, almost reveling in it, with those in on the joke. That would be my take on it, Lang said. The inventiveness seems to me in some ways really to come to the heart of the matter, even though it's subtler than the brutality. Primo Levi used the phrase needless violence, which is not quite what I'm saying. It's the element of gratuitousness, but it's more than the gratuitousness. There seems to be this imaginative protraction, elaboration, that one finds best exemplified in art forms, and which in art we usually take to be indicative of a consciousness, an artistic consciousness, of an overall design. An artistic consciousness in the design and enactment of evil? Yes, he says, in part because the notion of an art of evil implies a knowing awareness of wrongdoing. If the locus of evil is in the degree of consciousness of the evil nature of an act, artistic consciousness is almost by definition the most elaborate, the deepest kind of consciousness. It's the role of the imagination in the elaboration of their acts, Lang suggests, that indicates an artistic consciousness of evil at work in the perpetrators of the final solution. Brutality is straightforward. It's not imaginative. This isn't just brute strength. It seems to me that there is a sense of irony constantly. The sign, over the entrance gate to Auschwitz, you know, Arbeit macht frei. Work will make you free. It's like a joke. It is a joke. The orchestra playing as these people go out to work. Ironic consciousness, artistic consciousness imply contemplation, deliberation, knowing elaboration. It's there in Hitler's ostentatiously artistic falsehood in the table talk about the rumor they're exterminating the Jews. I had an intimation of a connection I thought Lang might be driving at. If the signature of self-aware evil in the genocide project was the artistic consciousness that went into its elaboration, execution, and concealment, might one source of that be Hitler's own lifelong conception of himself as an artist? Or, as I put it haltingly to Lang, the notion that artistry or artistic imagination is what is distinctive about Nazi evil, it makes sense in a way of what I hadn't been able to put my finger on. But when you spoke of the art of it, I found myself wondering, Hitler as an artist, was this the source he thought of himself as? Well, there is no question that in some ways, some very obvious ways, he was an artist, Lang replied. I mean those rallies and his presentation of himself in his speeches. Those are nothing if not art. Now, as to whether at its depth, whether one could speak of the whole as artistry, I couldn't have a judgment on that. But he then began to speak in a fascinating way about similarities between the thinking process of the artist and that of the conscious evildoer. There is an element of deliberation and pride. We think of style in artwork as presupposing the choice among alternatives, a systematic series of choices which excludes some and includes other alternatives, and then build on each other. And where moral issues are at stake, then one has to say, well, I mean one could speak of moral style, using the moral as an aesthetic. There has to be at least the consciousness of evil which plays its role, consciousness of the road not taken, awareness that the road taken is one that's believed to be evil, and the presence of inventiveness, imagination. This is not to say that at the level of the killing squads and the extermination chambers there was an artistic sensibility, although in the latter there was a diabolical art of deceit. It is rather a sensibility that inheres in the minds of the designers and architects of the elaborate system. Lang brings the point home dramatically with his critique of the now overly familiar but not clearly defined notion of the banality of evil that Hannah Arendt introduced in her book on the Adolf Eichmann trial. Arendt says that Eichmann demonstrates the lack of imagination in evil, but I think it's there, an imagination in his acts. One doesn't require genius to have imagination. Nobody is so banal as to be without imagination. While Arendt tries to define evil as thoughtlessness, heedlessness of moral questions, Lang sees it as thoughtfulness, in the sense of literally being full of thought, of the roads taken and not taken, of deliberation and imagination, at least in the case of the Nazis. Evil not as lack of imagination, but as too much, too artistic an imaginative consciousness of wrongdoing. Let's consider provisionally what viewing Hitler's evil as an aspect of his self-image as artist might entail. We know he defined himself in his childhood as an artist. We know his assertion of that identity set him in conflict with his powerful father, who disapproved, and brought him closer to his mother, who encouraged the sensitive soul side of young Adolf. We know that after his father's death he felt liberated enough to set out for Vienna to pursue his artistic dream, only to be brutally disillusioned when he was rejected as lacking the talent even to study art at the Vienna Academy of Fine Arts. It was a rejection that was to have a shattering and lasting impact on his life. Of course, even after his rejection by the Academy and his subsequent rejection by the School of Architecture, the young Hitler continued to define himself as an artist. Even in the men's shelter, he continued to hand-paint postcards to sell on the street. In the trenches of the First World War, he tirelessly sketched fellow soldiers and the ravaged wartime landscape. He was not, as those inclined to ridicule and underestimate him mistakenly like to say, a house painter. He might not have been a good painter. His landscapes are cliched and depopulated, but he was a painter for all that. He was an artist not just in output, but in personal temperament as well. In the Munich demi-monde he inhabited in the Weimar era, in the salons of the disreputable Bohemian aristocrats who cultivated him, Hitler adopted the pose of the temperamental artiste with much talk of Wagner and the need to restore the artistic ideals of Greek classicism. It is the pose that flourished into absurd grandiosity in the endless art appreciation monologues in the table talk, in the conscious artistic design of the Nuremberg rallies, and in the monstrous totalitarian architectural fantasies he planned, and sometimes executed, with Albert Speer. As Gordon Craig points out, Thomas Mann was one of the first to recognize that at the heart of Hitler's appeal to the German people was his presentation of himself as a myth-making artist rather than as a politician. And finally, at the bitter end, in the depths of the bunker, with Soviet troops and his own suicide just days away, Hitler could not be drawn into practical discussions of his dire situation because he could not be drawn away from contemplation of the scale model of his ultimate architectural fantasy, rebuilding his hometown of Linz into the cultural capital and art repository of the 1,000-year Reich. It was Hitler's vanity as well to surround himself with collaborators who saw themselves as artistic in some form. Heydrich was an accomplished classical violinist, Goebbels a novelist, Goering a predatory art collector, and of course there was Speer, Hitler's aesthetic soulmate. And not without deliberation does Richard Breitman call Himmler the architect of genocide. In a study of the architecture of Auschwitz, Deborah Dwork and Robert Jan von Pelt make the case that, to a greater extent than anyone had imagined, Lang's thesis about the death camps as a conscious work of the art of evil is confirmed by the actual theory and practice of the designers of Auschwitz. In fact, in recent years, a whole school of thinking about Hitler and the Holocaust has emerged, which places its aesthetic and artistic focus at the heart of the matter. Artistic consciousness not as a byproduct of the Nazi project, but as its source. A recent film called The Architecture of Doom by Munich's Peter Cohen traces the source of Nazi racism in perverted aesthetics, much as Fritz Gerlich suggested in his satire of Hitler's racial science. Others go further and see Nazi racist consciousness as an outgrowth of the mainstream Western tradition of idealizing aesthetics, a perversion at the heart of Western culture itself, as Yale's George Hersey argues in The Evolution of Allure. Hersey sees Nazi eugenics as a demonic art that tried to sculpt a racist idea of perfection from the flesh of the genome, through primitive biogenetic engineering that entailed euthanasia, eugenics, and mass murder as racial sculpting tools. Perhaps the Munich Post journalists were onto something when they chose as a signature epithet of abuse for Hitler the phrase political counterfeiter. A counterfeiter, after all, is a forger, an artist of sorts, even if an artist of falsity, of fraud. And perhaps the contemporary novelist D.M. Thomas was onto something when he ventured that in certain disturbing respects, Hitler and Kafka were fellow artists, almost psychic twins, both alienated figures on the margins of the German Reich, who fashioned a vision, an art, out of despair and dispossession, both possessing imaginations capable of conceiving of a concentration camp world, although Hitler had the evil dream and the will to bring into being Kafka's nightmare. There's a passage in Thomas's novel Pictures at an Exhibition, a passage growing out of his meditation on Kafka and Hitler as twinned artists, in which a character writes to a friend, "I need to know more about modernism. It seems to me you could consider the death camps a form of repulsive art. They had a terrible beauty of pragmatic efficiency, with surreal overtones. I mean, the arrival by train, which you normally think of as a homecoming, or else opening up the excitement of a holiday. And the orchestras playing jolly music. The metaphors of purification, the bathhouses, and the cleansing furnace." As we'll see, the Kafka-Hitler link has become a ground of great contention. But does this way of thinking add anything to our understanding of Hitler and the character of Hitler's evil? Looking at Hitler through the lens of artist and artistic consciousness does succeed in linking certain of his obsessive preoccupations. Consider the extremity with which Hitler urged a war of extermination against degenerate art and the degenerate modernists and Jewish artists who produced it. It's possible to see his vision of inferior peoples and degenerate races as perverted artistic judgments. Inferior races were the degenerate art of biological creation. One could argue that the singular signature gesture of Nazi evil was a kind of act of demonic connoisseurship. The encounter between Nazi and Jew on the train arrival platform at Auschwitz was an encounter of selection, of a kind of murderous, connoisseur-like discrimination, an almost curatorial ritual. Indeed, the official Auschwitz term for the ritual of choosing between those destined to die instantly and those destined to be worked and tormented to death in a protracted artistic fashion had a chilling curatorial ring: the selections. At the very least, looking at Hitler's evil through the lens of the artistic consciousness it exhibited helps refute the rectitude objection. There is a conscious relish in the horrific transgressiveness of the dehumanization process, a kind of artistic process in reverse, a decreation, in which humans are reconfigured, resculpted into subhumans, a relish in the process that cannot be defended as a self-sacrificing descent to ruthless methods for an idealistic cause. The methods were the essence. The methods were the madness. The creation of a unique art of evil raises another issue on which Lang has some provocative thoughts to offer: the question of whether there is an evolution of evil, a progression to previously unknown forms of wickedness in the Nazi era. I asked Lang if he believed it was Hitler's creation of an art of evil that made the Nazi genocide a new benchmark, a new fact in the history of evil. Lang had first broached the idea of a progression in the development, an evolution in the gravity of evil, in a piece entitled "The History of Evil and the Future of the Holocaust," published in Lessons and Legacies, a collection of essays. In arguing that evil has a history, a development from the first intentional murder, of Abel or whomever, to Hitler's genocide, Lang had not made use of the artistic metaphor. But in discussing with me whether evil might have further stages to evolve beyond Hitler, he did. I suggested, in the essay, that this may not be the last phase of evil. I would use the artistic analogy. I mean, if one can talk about the future of art, we are speaking of the imagination. I think it does require an act of the imagination, of the immoral imagination, to conceive of genocide as they did. And if one speaks of the imagination, then one feature of it that distinguishes it, really, is the kind of unpredictability of it. You're saying if you could predict the next stage, it really wouldn't be the next stage, I suggested. Yes, he said, and shifted to the notion of genius. If there is genius in art, in a Mozart, and there can be genius in morality, a Gandhi, is there not an analogy to artistic genius and the genius of evil? Genius shows us something we've never seen before. A kind of evil we've never seen before? An evil that transcends Hitler's? It's a breathtaking notion. It's, by definition, beyond imagination. Or has it already made its presence felt? I asked Lang if he thought the phenomenon of Holocaust denial, or revisionism, as it's sometimes called, might be the ingenious new development in the history of evil. After all, the revisionists at heart not only are pleased about the Holocaust, they seek to add, in a diabolically inventive way, insult to injury by branding the survivors and victims as liars. They exterminate the exterminated all over again by saying their deaths never existed. In their counterfeit of history, these real deaths were counterfeit. Is there not a demonic art to this, a quantum leap in the imagination of evil, in devising a way to torment the already exterminated? Lang resisted the idea. He argued that since the revisionists don't deny that if the Holocaust had occurred it would have been a crime, they are at least implicitly characterizing the notion of killing the Jews as something wrong, something one would want to deny. I'd argue that the revisionists are frankly lying when they say they think that it would have been bad if it had occurred. In fact, as the recent book on the German neo-Nazi movement by Ingo Hasselbach and Tom Rees, Führer X, demonstrates, in private, among themselves, they express great delight it occurred, and seek to deny it in public only as a way of tormenting the already tormented survivors by dishonoring the dead. They make dancing on the graves of the dead into an evil choreography, an art. Lang suggests an alternate conception of the next step in the evolution of evil, an evil more highly evolved than Hitler's evil, albeit without the massive body count, the one embodied in the post-war attitude of Martin Heidegger, the philosopher who became a Nazi sycophant for purposes of academic self-advancement during the war. Heidegger, says Lang, who'd been studying his life and work for his book Heidegger's Silence, knew it happened and he didn't care. His silence, it wasn't even denial. For him, it wasn't important. It wasn't important. It wasn't important. Lang repeats in an uncharacteristic outburst of impassioned bitterness. Now, if you ask which of them is worse, the revisionists deny it occurred. If one asks about their motives for denying it, one can say all kinds of things, but at least if it occurred, it would have been wrong. But Heidegger knows it occurred, but it's just not important. It's not something to distort history to deny. For Heidegger, this is not history to concern oneself with. For Lang, this unconcern with history is worse than falsifying it. Knowing and not caring is worse than the art of denying, forging, and counterfeiting. I'd suggest he underestimates how highly evolved an art revisionism has become. Lang has never met David Irving and tried to grapple directly with the avatar of scholarly revisionism. I have. Chapter 12. David Irving, The Big Oops, in which we explore the mind of Hitler's ambassador to the afterlife, witness the Hitler spell in action, and meet once again Hitler as a newborn babe. Ringing the bell on the heavily fortified, high-tech security-equipped entrance to David Irving's living quarters on Duke Street in London, I couldn't help recall Alan Bullock's words on Irving. Bullock had taken great pains to make the point that his return to the polemical fray, with a public lecture on Hitler's role in the Holocaust, had not been a direct or ad hominem response to David Irving's vigorous advocacy of Hitler's non-involvement, but was rather a response to revisionists and Holocaust deniers in general. He didn't want to dignify Irving as an opponent, as a representative of a legitimate rival school of historical explanation and interpretation. But Bullock is fascinated, or at least horrified, by the phenomenon of Irving. "He's a real rabble-rouser," Bullock says. "A real Hitler speaker." A Hitler speaker? "Aye," Bullock says, reverting to his native North Country accent in his contempt for David Irving, Hitler explainer turned Hitler defender. "Aye, he goes over the top. He goes to Germany and whips it up." Bullock was referring to newspaper reports of David Irving addressing rallies of German sympathizers. I had one of those reports in my possession, a 1991 dispatch by Gita Sereni, author of Albert Speer, His Battle with Truth. She depicts Irving telling a Hamburg audience that in 2 years, "this myth of mass murders of Jews in the death factories of Auschwitz, Majdanek, and Treblinka, which in fact never took place, will be laid to rest." 2 days later, Sereni reports, Irving delivered his message to a mob of tattooed, flag-waving youths in the former East German city of Halle. The crowd shouted Sieg Heil when he extolled the heroism of that great German martyr, Rudolf Hess. For all his mystical contemplation of the notion of Jesus embracing Judas, Bullock seems to see Irving as an unforgivable Judas to historical truth. Clearly, he simply despises him. "Strange little rascal," Bullock said of Irving. We'd been talking about conscious evil. "I do think he was evil. He whips it up, and he knows he's doing it." Is David Irving evil? If evil is a destination, Bullock believes Irving has already arrived at the station. I'm not sure. I believe I saw him at a moment when he'd reached the last stop before the terminal and was in the process of deciding whether to step off or go the distance. Indeed, the decision-making process seemed to be going on before my eyes. It's rare to see the defining moment of such a process enacted out loud, but that's what I felt I was watching as I listened to Irving struggle with a fateful dilemma over a manuscript, one he is proud of discovering and yet wants to repudiate, delegitimize, because it contains within it a refutation of the last 2 decades of his work, because it contains that which Irving had long insisted would never be found, did not exist, evidence of Adolf Hitler's personal order, the long-sought Führerbefehl, the directive ordering the extermination of the Jews. It was this manuscript, this decision process, that led me to overcome my reservations about speaking to Irving when I was in London to talk to Bullock and Trevor Roper. I wanted to know if Irving was, as he seemed to indicate in a recent interview with the Telegraph, seriously considering revising his revisionist views. The manuscript is a purported memoir by Adolf Eichmann, and a foot-thick photocopy of it was sitting on Irving's desk and weighing heavily on his mind the afternoon I visited him in his study on Duke Street. Also on his desk was a bust of Goebbels and a tiny toy soldier figure of Hitler. Irving's a tall, florid-faced fellow in country tweeds whose face can twitch when he becomes agitated, which he often seemed to be in the course of our conversation, particularly when it came to the dilemma of the Eichmann memoir. Irving had established his reputation as a Hitler controversialist with the publication in 1977 of Hitler's War, a book in which his professed aim was to describe the origin and conduct of the war through Hitler's eyes, from behind his desk. Many acknowledge Irving's diligence in digging up from German sources a large number of private papers, diaries, and documents long thought lost. Whatever allegations may be leveled at Irving as a historian, and there have been many, There is no doubting his ability to sniff out original documents, Robert Harris wrote in his account of the 1983 Hitler Diaries fiasco. Still, most rejected the conclusion Irving had been driving at ever since Hitler's war, that the absence of any written order from Hitler to pursue the final solution proves that he didn't order it and probably didn't know about it. In taking that position, he was going further, but not much further, than the more extreme functionalists among the German historians in the intentionalist-functionalist debate of the 1980s. The functionalists argue that while Hitler might have known of it, the Holocaust happened almost by spontaneous combustion, that it was the bureaucratic byproduct of wartime circumstances and the complicity of the Nazi leaders lower than Hitler in the hierarchy, Himmler and Heydrich, Goering and Goebbels, along with regional authorities in the occupied Eastern territories, acting largely on their own initiatives. But in the 20 years since the publication of Hitler's War, Irving's views have undergone a shift or several shifts back and forth, from mild dissident to apparent agreement with radical Holocaust deniers, back to apparent assent to the fact of mass murder, albeit murder ordered by others than Hitler. On that he's been consistent. Occasionally no Holocaust, always no Hitler. And to an ever-increasing extent, Irving has come out from behind his desk to become a fiery, rabble-rousing Führer of the Holocaust denial movement, addressing adoring, frankly neo-Nazi rallies in Germany, and, not surprisingly, in Argentina. "He really whips it up," Bullock had said, and indeed, on Irving's desk is a video cassette whose slipcase is adorned with a graphic picture of Irving whipping it up in front of a crowd of cheering deniers, eerily conjuring up the figure he's obsessed with. In any case, it was at one of those rallies in Argentina that someone handed Irving a time bomb of a manuscript. It was evidently meant as a gift, a tribute from one believer in the cause to its leader, but the gift turned out to be a poisoned apple. The Jewish community in Argentina was foolish enough to denounce me in the national press as being a National Socialist agitator, Irving told me. Whereupon things got interesting. I was immediately whisked out of my hotel and kept in an army villa because my host said that in Argentina, when people call you names like that, they're not fooling. The beneficial consequence was that at the end of the next meeting, a guy came out to me with a brown paper package, and he said, "You're obviously the correct repository for these papers that we've been looking after since 1960 for the Eichmann family. See, the Eichmann family panicked when he was kidnapped in the streets, and they took all his private papers which they could find that had any kind of bearing, put them into brown paper, and gave them to a friend. Then he gave them to this man who gave them to me, who gave them to the German government, who threw me in jail and called me all these things," Irving adds, getting distracted by more recent events. He was imprisoned briefly in Munich before being expelled from Germany as a Holocaust denier. A Munich court convicted him in 1992 of slandering the murdered Jews. "This is my photocopy of them," he says, indicating a stack of papers. "I gave the original to the German government, but I made a good photocopy before I gave it to them." I asked Irving if he could show me the bombshell Führer order passage that's been tormenting him ever since he came across the alleged Eichmann memoirs. He flipped through the stack to a passage flagged by a yellow post-it note. "It's rather mind-boggling. He, Eichmann, refers on many occasions to a discussion he had with Heydrich at the end of September or October 1941, in which Heydrich says, in quotation marks, these two lines, which Irving quotes from the manuscript. 'I come from the Reichsfuhrer,' Himmler. 'He has received orders from the Führer for the physical destruction of the Jews.'" It's fairly unequivocal, and more disturbing to Irving, It appears in a memoir he believes written before Eichmann's capture and trial testimony. He keeps coming back to it, Irving tells me. Comes back to it again and again. These flags, he indicates the post-it notes with which he's marked other places where Eichmann recalls the order for the final solution. When did you first come upon this? I asked him. Christmas Eve, 1991, Irving recalls. It rocked me back on my heels, frankly, because I thought, oops. He laughs, trying to make a joke out of his discomfort. How do you explain this one away? A good question. The quote, if authentic, knocks a hole not only in Irving's then-current no Holocaust position, but also in his earlier no Hitler involvement in the Holocaust position. It was deeply disturbing, Irving admits. I had to tell myself, don't be knocked off your feet by this one. The obvious solution was to declare the Eichmann memoirs a forgery, consigning their revelations to the trash bin with the Hitler diaries. But Irving was committed to the authenticity of the Eichmann find, and furthermore, he claims, the authenticity has been verified by the German Federal Archives at Koblenz. This is only partially true. A spokesman at the Koblenz archives told my researcher that the memoirs appear to be cobbled together from interviews with Eichmann by a sympathetic journalist and other sources. Irving's reputation as recoverer of lost Hitler treasures probably can't stand another flip-flop. In the 1983 Hitler Diaries affair, Irving at first denounced the purported diaries as forgeries, and then at the last minute switched and pronounced them real, precisely reversing Hugh Trevor Roper's switch, but landing, unfortunately, on the wrong side. Now, with the Eichmann memoirs, Irving portrayed himself as torn between his desire for vindication as a digger-up of authentic diary treasures and his position as a Hitler exonerator. He shared his dilemma with the London Telegraph in 1992 in a quote that made it seem as if he might be retreating from his no-gas chamber position to a revision of his revisionism. Quite clearly, this has given me a certain amount of food for thought, and I will spend much of this year thinking about it. They, the memoirs, show that Eichmann believed there was a Führer order. It makes me glad I've not adopted the narrow-minded approach that there was no Holocaust. I've never adopted that view. Eichmann describes in such very great detail that you have to accept there were mass exterminations. By the time I saw him, however, Irving's year of reflection on the subject was over, and he was once again very close to denying the truth of the Eichmann memoirs, rather than conceding Hitler had a role in the Holocaust. He unveils for me a strategy to discredit the Eichmann extermination order statement without discrediting the memoirs as a whole. They aren't counterfeit, but Eichmann could have been lying when he wrote them. Irving's come up with a rather flimsy conceptual framework on which to hang his desire to disbelieve Eichmann's words. The Suez Crisis. I tried to apply the 3 criteria that Hugh Trevor Roper thought were indispensable to reading documents, Irving tells me. 3 questions you ask of a document. Was it genuine? Was it written by somebody who was in a position to know what he's writing about? And why does this document exist? The 3rd one is the crucial one with the Eichmann papers. He's writing in 1956 at the time of the Suez Crisis. We know because he refers to it. And 1956, he's aware that any day now his cover may be blown and he may be arrested. It took me a while to figure out why the Suez Crisis would suddenly cause Eichmann to believe his cover might be blown, but I believe Irving envisions Eichmann thinking that an Israeli conquest of Cairo, or capture of high-ranking Egyptian officers, might put Israelis in possession of intelligence files on the fugitive Nazi network, from which Egypt had recruited scientists and weapons technicians, and thus lead them to Eichmann's location. From this far-fetched projection of Eichmann's paranoia, Irving deduces that Eichmann must have had sleepless nights wondering what he's going to do, what he's going to say to get off the hook. And though he's not consciously doing it, I think his brain is probably rationalizing in the background, trying to find alibis. The alibi that would have been useful to him in his own fevered mind would be if he could say that Hitler, all he did was carry out Hitler's orders. And I'm certain that at some time Heydrich would have said something like that to assure him. Der Führer hat direkt der Ausrottung der Juden befohlen, which is a typical Hitler phrase. When Hitler used the word Ausrottung, it didn't carry the connotation which the word Ausrottung carries now, which is very important to know. I've got a whole card index on Hitler's use of the word Ausrottung. But, of course, Ausrottung means extirpation, weeding out something and discarding it. Get rid of it. It was only in reading over the transcript of this discourse that it occurred to me how transparently Irving was projecting his own dilemma about the Führer order onto his image of Eichmann's thought world during the Suez Crisis. He must have had sleepless nights wondering what he's going to do, what he's going to say to get off the hook. And although he's not consciously doing it, I think his brain is probably rationalizing in the background, trying to find out alibis in his own fevered mind. As Eichmann confronted the possibility of discovery and capture, so in his sleepless nights, in his fevered mind, David Irving confronted the possibility of refutation by his Eichmann discovery. And the conclusion about the memoir he offers me now derives from his Suez fantasy. The first thing one has to say, it's not a document with sufficient evidentiary value to weigh very much in the balance against the other documents from the other direction, which are of evidentiary value. It's one which gives me pause for thought, but having thought about it, I am inclined to say that it's not enough on its own to tilt the balance. The pose, the rhetoric, are that of the serious historian weighing evidentiary value in the balance, and yet the pose may be a counterfeit. According to a London paper, Irving confided that he is simply trying to manipulate the media. The balance has already been tilted. When he speaks of these other documents from the other direction, he implies the existence of documents that somehow prove or state Hitler did not issue an extermination order. But in fact, those who take that position argue not from other documents, but from an absence of documents, the unavailability of a signed, notarized Führer order for the final solution, an absence that, in any case, might only prove Hitler's desire to conceal. How did David Irving get to this point, tying himself into knots to exculpate Hitler? Some, not all, of the historians I'd asked about Irving spoke respectfully of his work in the 70s in unearthing previously unseen Hitler-era documents. I mentioned this to him. They think I've really gone round the bend now? Irving half asked, half stated. He has a peculiar concern for his reputation with other historians, a reputation which, as he put it to me, is down to its uppers, but hasn't yet worn through to the street. How did Irving go round that bend? From the way he described it to me, the crucial development was his attempt to break into the inner circle, or the magic circle, as he characterized it to me, of surviving former Hitler confidants. Once inside that magic circle, he became a living example of, the continuing power of the Hitler spell. There were, however, stirrings of skepticism about the conventional vision of Hitler as early as his wartime childhood, he tells me. Unlike Americans, we English suffered great deprivations during the Second World War, Irving tells me. He was born in 1938, and we went through childhood with no toys. We had no kind of childhood at all. We were living on an island that was crowded with other people's armies. The alternative to this irritating state of affairs, of course, was to live on an island occupied by Hitler's army. What disturbed Irving, he tells me, was not the deprivation, but the rationing of truth. We saw the losses in Allied air fleets by watching the formations take off and return with great gaps in them. After bombing missions, he said.